The thing about hunting Kodiak Island is that it changes you. Even before you pull the trigger, even before you see your first bear, just being there, in that vast wilderness where everything is bigger and older and more dangerous than anywhere else on Earth, it gets into your bones. I've been telling this story for 3 years now. 3 years since I limped out of that frozen gorge with my leg in a makeshift splint and my left eye seeing the world through a permanent haze. 3 years of waking up in cold sweats, 3 years of jumping at shadows, 3 years of people asking me what happened to my face. But I'm getting ahead of myself. It started like every other hunting trip I'd taken. October 2021. I'd saved for 2 years to afford a solo hunt on Kodiak Island, the kind of trip that separates the weekend warriors from the real hunters. My buddy Jake had backed out last minute. His wife was pregnant and she didn't want him going alone. Smart woman. I should have listened to her. But I was stubborn. 34 years old, 10 years of hunting experience under my belt, and tired of playing it safe. I'd hunted black bears in Montana, elk in Colorado, even spent a week tracking moose in Alaska's interior. Kodiak felt like the next logical step, the final test. The flight from Anchorage to Kodiak was bumpy. Small plane, just me and the pilot, flying through grey clouds that seemed to stretch forever. The pilot, grizzled guy named Tom with hands like leather, kept glancing back at me during the flight. "First time on the island?" he asked over the engine noise. "Yeah, hunting alone. That's the plan." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "You know, most guys who hunt Kodiak alone either come back different or don't come back at all." I laughed it off, told him I'd done my homework, had my GPS, satellite beacon, enough food for 10 days, high-powered rifle with a good scope, first aid kit, fire starter, all the gear a responsible hunter carries. Tom just nodded and focused on his instruments, but I caught him looking at me in that small mirror pilots use, like he was memorizing my face. The drop-off point was a narrow beach on the island's remote northeast coast. Tom helped me unload my gear, and we went over the pickup plan. 7 days, same spot. If I wasn't there, he'd call search and rescue. "Weather's supposed to turn bad in a few days," he said, checking his watch. "Storm coming in from the Bering Sea. You sure you don't want me to pick you up earlier?" "I'll be fine," I told him. 7 days. He shook his head and climbed back into the plane. The engine roared to life, and within minutes I was alone. The sound of the plane faded, replaced by something I'd never experienced before. Absolute silence. Not the kind of quiet you get in the suburbs when the neighbours turn off the TVs. This was different, deeper, like the island was holding its breath, waiting to see what I'd do next. I shouldered my pack and started inland. The terrain was rougher than I'd expected. What looked like gentle hills from the air turned out to be steep ridges covered in thick alder and devil's club. Every step was a negotiation with thorns and hidden rocks, but the beauty was incredible. Streams so clear you could count the stones on the bottom, mountains that seemed to touch the sky, and everywhere signs of wildlife, deer tracks, fox scat, and yes, bear sign. Lots of it. I found a good spot to make camp about 3 miles inland, a small clearing beside a creek, surrounded by towering spruce trees, good sight lines, fresh water, plenty of deadfall for firewood. I set up my tent, organised my gear, and built a fire as the sun started to set. That first night, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks up into the star-filled sky. I cooked a simple meal of freeze-dried beef stew and listened to the sounds of the wilderness settling in for the night. An owl hooted somewhere in the distance. Water babbled over rocks. Normal sounds, peaceful sounds. I slept well that first night. The next morning, I woke before dawn and started tracking. Found fresh bear sign about a half mile from camp. Claw marks on a spruce tree, 8 feet off the ground. Big bear, very big. The scratches were deep, carved into the bark like someone had taken a knife to it. I followed the trail for most of the morning, moving slowly, staying downwind. The bear had been feeding on salmon in a small tributary about 2 miles south of my camp. I could smell the fish before I saw the stream, that rich, organic smell of spawning salmon mixed with something else, something musky and wild. I found a good vantage point on a ridge overlooking the stream and settled in to wait. Hunting Kodiak bears isn't like hunting other game. You don't chase them, you don't call them. You find where they feed and you wait, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. Around noon he showed up. I've seen a lot of bears in my time, but nothing had prepared me for this. He was massive, easily 9 feet tall when he reared up on his hind legs to sniff the air. His coat was dark brown, almost black, with silver tips that caught the sunlight. Scars crisscrossed his face and shoulders, telling the story of a long life of fights and survival. But it wasn't just his size that got to me, it was the way he moved, confident, deliberate. Like he knew he was the apex predator in this ecosystem and had nothing to fear from anything. I raised my rifle and found him in the scope. Perfect broadside shot, maybe 150 yards. An easy kill for someone with my experience, but something made me hesitate. Maybe it was the way he looked up at the ridge where I was hiding, his small black eyes seeming to stare right through the scope and into my soul. For just a moment, I felt like the prey instead of the predator. The feeling passed and I steadied my aim, but when I squeezed the trigger, the bear was gone, vanished into the thick brush like a ghost, leaving me staring at empty water. I sat there for another hour hoping he'd come back, but the stream remained empty except for the salmon jumping and splashing in the shallows. That evening I moved my camp, not because of fear, at least that's what I told myself, but because a good hunter adapts to the animal's patterns. The bear was feeding downstream, so I moved upstream, found another clearing, this one smaller and more enclosed, nestled in a narrow gorge between two steep ridges. The new campsite felt different, more enclosed. The trees seemed to lean in closer and the shadows were deeper, but it had everything I needed: water, shelter, concealment, and it was closer to where I'd seen the bear. As I set up my tent for the second time, I noticed the weather was changing. The clear skies of the past 2 days were giving way to thick grey clouds. The wind was picking up and the temperature was dropping. Tom's storm was coming. That night, the forest was different, louder. The wind howled through the trees and branches creaked and groaned overhead. My fire seemed smaller somehow, its light barely pushing back the darkness that pressed in from all sides. I was just getting ready to turn in when I heard it, a sound that made every hair on my body stand up. Breathing, not the wind, not a tree branch rubbing against another branch. Breathing, slow, deliberate and close. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it into the trees beyond my camp. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating patches of forest, but I couldn't see anything. Still, I knew something was out there, watching, waiting. I spent that night sitting by the fire, rifle across my knees, feeding logs into the flames every time they started to die down. Every shadow looked like a threat. Every sound made me jump, but nothing happened. No glowing eyes appeared at the edge of my camp. No massive shape emerged from the darkness. When dawn finally came, I felt foolish, spooked by my own imagination. But when I went to check my gear, I found something that made my blood run cold. Tracks, huge bear tracks, less than 20 feet from my tent. The bear had walked completely around my camp during the night, close enough that I should have heard him, close enough that he could have attacked if he'd wanted to. But he hadn't attacked, he'd just watched. I spent that day tracking him again, but the weather was getting worse. The wind was constant now, and a light rain had started to fall. The temperature had dropped at least 20 degrees since the day before, and my breath came out in visible puffs. Around mid-afternoon, I was following a game trail along the bottom of the gorge when disaster struck. I was moving carefully along a steep section where the trail wound between house-sized boulders. The rocks were slick with rain, and moss covered most of the surfaces. I was placing each step carefully, using my rifle for balance, when my left foot hit a patch of wet moss and went out from under me. I fell hard, slamming into the rocks with a sickening crack that I felt more than heard. The pain hit me immediately, a white hot agony that shot up from my left leg and exploded in my brain. I tried to stand, but my leg wouldn't support any weight. I looked down and saw the problem. My left tibia was snapped, the bone bent at an unnatural angle beneath my hunting pants. Not a clean break either. I could feel bone fragments grinding against each other when I tried to move. For a moment, panic took over. I was alone, miles from help, with a broken leg and a storm coming in. My satellite beacon was in my pack, attached to a carabiner on the outside. I fumbled for it with shaking hands, powered it up, and pressed the emergency button. Nothing happened. I pressed it again. Still nothing. The LED display showed a low battery warning that hadn't been there the day before. The cold had drained it faster than expected. I had a spare battery in my pack, but when I tried to change it, the battery compartment was full of water. The unit was dead. The rain was getting heavier now, and the temperature was still dropping. I needed shelter, and I needed it fast. Using my rifle as a crutch, I managed to drag myself to a slight overhang in the rocks, about 50 yards away. It wasn't much, just a shallow cave formed by two boulders leaning against each other, but it would keep the rain off. I gathered as much dry wood as I could find and built a fire at the mouth of the cave. The flames flickered and danced in the wind, but they held. As darkness fell, that fire became my lifeline, not just for warmth, but for protection. Because I could feel eyes on me again. The feeling was stronger now, more immediate. Whatever was out there in the darkness wasn't just watching anymore. It was getting closer. I fed another log into the fire and checked my rifle, fully loaded, with a spare magazine in my jacket pocket. If something came at me, I'd be ready. But as the night wore on, I began to realise that being ready might not be enough. The smell hit me first, a thick, musky odour that seemed to coat the inside of my nose and throat. It was animal, but wrong somehow. Too strong, too present, like whatever was making it was standing right next to me. Then came the silence. All at once, every sound in the forest stopped. No wind in the trees, no night birds calling, no small animals rustling in the underbrush. Even the rain seemed to fall more quietly, as if the forest was holding its breath. In that unnatural quiet, I heard a new sound. Soft at first, barely audible over the crackling of my fire, but steady and rhythmic. Footsteps. Something large was moving through the forest, circling my position. The steps were too heavy to be a deer, too measured to be a moose. Each footfall seemed to shake the ground slightly, sending small pebbles rolling down the rocks around me. I raised my rifle and tried to peer into the darkness beyond my fire. The flames were bright enough to illuminate the immediate area around my shelter, but beyond that circle of light, the world was black as pitch. The footsteps stopped. For long minutes I sat frozen, rifle ready, waiting for something to emerge from the darkness. My heart was pounding so hard, I could hear it in my ears. Sweat ran down my face despite the cold. Then I saw the eyes, 2 points of reflected light, maybe 8 feet off the ground, staring at me from the edge of the firelight. They didn't blink, didn't move, just watched with an intelligence that made my skin crawl. "Get back!" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. "Get back, or I'll shoot!" The eyes disappeared. I sat there for another hour, rifle aimed at the spot where I'd seen them, but nothing else happened. Eventually, exhaustion began to take over. The pain in my leg was constant and throbbing, and I hadn't slept properly in over 24 hours. I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, I was jerking awake to the sound of my fire dying down. The flames had dropped to barely more than glowing coals, and the circle of light around my shelter had shrunk dramatically. That's when I realised the breathing sound was back, closer this time. I scrambled to add more wood to the fire, ignoring the screaming pain in my leg. The flames flared back to life, pushing the darkness back, and that's when I saw him. Hawks, the bear, stood at the very edge of the firelight, maybe 30 feet away. Up close, he was even more massive than I'd remembered. His shoulders were as broad as a car, and his head was the size of a large boulder. The scars on his face looked like they'd been carved by claws the size of kitchen knives. But it was his posture that terrified me most. He wasn't standing like a normal bear, head down, sniffing the air, ready to run at the first sign of trouble. This bear stood upright, on his hind legs, watching me with the same intelligent eyes I'd seen earlier. He was studying me, evaluating me, deciding what to do with me. I raised my rifle, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it steady. The bear watched me struggle with what might have been amusement. "Stay back," I whispered, though I doubt he could hear me over the wind. "Just stay back." The bear dropped to all fours and took a step forward. I fired. The shot was rushed, panicked, and wide. The bullet struck a tree somewhere to the bear's left, sending bark flying. The bear didn't even flinch. If anything, he seemed annoyed by the noise. He took another step forward, now close enough that I could see the individual hairs in his coat rippling in the wind. Close enough that I could see the intelligence in his small black eyes. Close enough that I could smell his breath, a mixture of rotting fish and something else, something that smelled like death. I worked the bolt on my rifle and fired again. This shot was better. I saw dust puff up from his shoulder where the bullet hit, but it might as well have been a bee sting for all the effect it had. The bear shook himself once, like a dog shaking off the water, and kept coming. That's when everything went wrong at once. As I worked the bolt for a third shot, the bear charged. Not the lumbering run you see in nature documentaries, but a full-speed assault that covered the distance between us in seconds. I had just enough time to swing my rifle toward him when his massive shoulder slammed into the tree I'd been using as a brace. The impact was tremendous. The tree, a solid spruce maybe 8 inches in diameter, shuddered and cracked. My rifle, which had been leaning against it, was caught between the bear's momentum and the tree trunk. I watched in horror as the barrel bent like it was made of plastic. The scope shattered, sending glass fragments flying through the air. My primary weapon was destroyed in an instant. I rolled to the side, ignoring the agony in my broken leg, and reached for my backup, a hunting knife I kept on my belt. But my hands were numb with cold and fear, and the knife slipped from my fingers as I tried to draw it. I watched helplessly as it skittered across the rocky ground and disappeared into a crack between two boulders. 2 weapons down, 1 left. I fumbled in my jacket pocket for my emergency flare. My fingers were so cold I could barely feel the plastic cylinder, but I managed to grip it and pull it free. The bear had turned to face me again, and I could see him gathering himself for another charge. I pulled the tab on the flare and it ignited with a brilliant red light. For a moment, hope flared in my chest. Bears were supposed to be afraid of fire. This would scare him off. But as I drew back to throw it, my numb fingers betrayed me. The flare slipped from my grip and sailed wide, landing in a patch of wet moss 20 feet away. It hissed and sputtered, casting eerie red shadows on the trees, but doing nothing to stop the bear. I was out of options, out of weapons, out of hope. The bear lowered his head and charged again. That's when something primitive took over, some ancient part of my brain that remembered when humans were just another prey animal, struggling to survive in a world full of things with bigger teeth and sharper claws. I stopped thinking like a modern hunter with modern weapons and started thinking like my ancestors had. Fire, the first weapon, the thing that had allowed humans to survive when everything else wanted to eat them. My campfire was right there, 3 feet away, still burning strong. I lunged toward it, screaming with pain, as my broken legs scraped against the rocks. My hand closed around the biggest piece of burning wood I could find, a chunk of birch about 3 feet long and thick as my wrist. The bark was curled and blackened, but underneath, the wood was burning hot and bright. The bear was 5 feet away and closing fast when I rolled over and thrust the burning log directly into his face. The contact was immediate and horrible. The smell of burning fur and flesh filled the air, and the bear let out a sound I'd never heard before, a high-pitched shriek that was part roar, part scream, part something else entirely, something that spoke of pain and rage and surprise. But I didn't let go, couldn't let go. My survival depended on keeping that burning wood pressed against the bare face and shoulders, no matter what. The heat was incredible, even through my hunting gloves. I could feel the leather starting to char, could smell my own skin beginning to burn. The bear reared back, swatting at the flames, but I held on. We were locked together now, predator and prey, fire and flesh, in a struggle that was older than civilization. My vision narrowed to a tunnel of red and orange. My world became nothing but heat and smoke, and the desperate need to keep the fire between me and those massive claws. The bear was screaming constantly now, a sound that echoed off the rocks and seemed to shake the very ground. But through his screams, I could hear another sound, my own voice, shouting wordlessly, like some kind of primitive war cry. I wasn't human anymore. I was just an animal fighting for its life with the only weapon I had left. The struggle seemed to last forever, but it probably only went on for a few seconds. Finally, the bear broke away, stumbling backward, pawing at his burned face. I could see blisters already forming on his nose and around his eyes. Patches of fur had been singed away, leaving raw, red skin underneath. For a moment we stared at each other across the dying flames of what had been my campfire. The bear's eyes, the ones that weren't swollen shut, held something I'd never seen there before. Fear. He turned and lumbered away into the darkness, leaving behind only the smell of burnt hair and flesh, and a sound I'll never forget. A low, pained moaning that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. I collapsed back against the rocks, still clutching the burned log like it was the most precious thing in the world, which I suppose it was. It had saved my life. But as the adrenaline began to fade, I realized something was wrong with my vision. The world seemed darker somehow, even with the flare still burning nearby. I blinked hard, thinking it was just smoke in my eyes, but the darkness remained. I raised my left hand to my face and could barely see it. Then I covered my right eye with my hand, and the world went almost completely black. The fire I'd used to save my life had cost me my left eye. The intense heat and bright flames, held so close to my face for so long, had permanently damaged my vision. I could still see shapes and light, but everything on the left side was blurred and distorted, like looking through frosted glass. I sat there in the ruins of my campsite, scattered gear, destroyed rifle, dying fire, and tried to process what had just happened. I'd survived an attack by one of the largest predators in North America, using nothing but a piece of burning wood and primitive instinct. But the victory had come at a cost that would follow me for the rest of my life. The storm was getting worse, the rain had turned to sleet, and the wind was howling through the gorge like something alive and angry. I needed to get warm and stay warm, or hypothermia would finish what the bear had started. I managed to rebuild my fire using the scattered coals and some dry wood I'd stored under an overhang. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep me alive through the night. I splinted my broken leg as best I could, using strips torn from my spare clothing and a straight piece of deadfall. Then I settled in to wait for dawn, and for rescue that might never come. The rest of that night was a blur of pain and cold, and the constant fear that the bear might come back. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow beyond the firelight looked like a massive shape preparing to charge. I kept that burned log within reach, ready to use it again if I had to. But the bear didn't come back. Maybe his injuries were worse than mine. Maybe he'd learned to respect fire. Or maybe he was just somewhere out there in the darkness, waiting for my fire to die down. Dawn finally came, grey and cold and unwelcome. The storm had passed, but it had left behind a world covered in ice and snow. My water bottles were frozen solid, and my tent had collapsed under the weight of wet snow. I knew I had to move, had to get back to the pickup point somehow. Even with a broken leg and damaged vision, Tom would be looking for me in 4 days, but I wasn't sure I could survive that long in my current condition. Using my damaged rifle as a crutch, I started the long journey back towards the coast. Every step was agony. The makeshift splint helped, but I could feel bone fragments grinding against each other with each movement. My vision problems made navigating even more difficult. I kept misjudging distances and stumbling over obstacles I couldn't see clearly. But I kept moving, had to keep moving. The alternative was dying alone in that frozen gorge, becoming another cautionary tale about hunters who bit off more than they could chew. It took me 3 days to cover the distance I'd hiked in less than 1 on the way in. 3 days of crawling over fallen logs, wading through icy streams, and sleeping in whatever shelter I could find. 3 days of rationing the little food I had left and melting snow for drinking water. On the morning of the 4th day, I heard the most beautiful sound in the world, the drone of a small aircraft engine. Tom found me about half a mile from the pickup point, using my orange emergency panel to signal his location. I must have looked like hell, because his face went white when he saw me. "Jesus Christ," he said, helping me into the plane. "What happened to you?" I told him the story during the flight back to Kodiak town. All of it. The stalking, the attack, the fire. He listened without comment until I finished. "You're lucky to be alive," he said finally. "Most guys who tangle with a bear like that don't walk away." "I didn't walk away," I corrected him, gesturing to my splintered leg and damaged eye. "I crawled. The doctors in Kodiak did what they could for my leg, but I needed surgery that was beyond their capabilities. They medevaced me to Anchorage, where orthopedic surgeons spent 6 hours putting my tibia back together with pins and plates. My eye was a different story. The damage was permanent. Thermal burns to the cornea and retina that couldn't be repaired. I'd be partially blind for the rest of my life. But I was alive. The story made the local papers, and then the national news. Hunter used fire to fight off Kodiak bear. Most of the reporters wanted to focus on the drama, the heroics, the man versus nature angle. They didn't understand the cost. I tried to go back to hunting after I recovered. Told myself it was just another challenge to overcome, like learning to shoot with one good eye. But the first time I was alone in the woods, sitting in a deer stand in familiar territory back home in Montana, I heard a branch snap in the distance and nearly fell out of the tree. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't hold my rifle steady. My heart was pounding like I'd just run a marathon. The smell of pine sap reminded me of smoke and burning fur, and I had to fight not to vomit. I climbed down from that stand and haven't been hunting since. The nightmare started about a month after I got home. Always the same dream. I'm back in that gorge, facing the bear again, but this time the fire goes out. This time there's no burning log to save me. I wake up screaming, covered in sweat, my left eye throbbing with phantom pain. My wife says I talk in my sleep now, mutter about fire and bears and the smell of burning fur. She's patient about it, but I can see the worry in her eyes, the fear that whatever I brought back from that island might be more than she can handle. Sometimes I catch myself staring into our fireplace, remembering the weight of that burning log in my hands, the desperate strength that came from somewhere deep inside when death was seconds away, the primitive satisfaction of using humanity's first weapon to drive back the darkness. Other times, I wonder if I really won that fight, or if the bear just decided I wasn't worth finishing off. Maybe he's still out there in that gorge, with scars on his face to match the ones I carry. Maybe he learned something that night too, that even the smallest, weakest prey can be dangerous when cornered. The insurance company paid out on my hunting gear, but I never replaced any of it. What's the point? I can't go back to being the hunter I was before, the man who thought he could take on anything the wilderness threw at him with enough preparation and the right equipment. That man died in a frozen gorge on Kodiak Island, killed by the realization that all our modern tools and weapons mean nothing when you're face to face with something that's been perfecting the art of killing for millions of years. But something else was born in that gorge too. Something harder and more primitive, something that knows how to survive when everything else fails. I carry a lighter with me everywhere now, a simple Zippo, nothing fancy. I flip it open and closed when I'm nervous, feeling the weight of it in my pocket. People think it's just a nervous habit, but it's more than that. It's a reminder that fire is still our best defense against the darkness, that no matter how civilized we become, how many weapons we invent, how much technology we develop, there are still things out there that only understand the language of flame and heat. The doctors say my leg healed perfectly. The limp is barely noticeable now, and the pins and plates don't give me much trouble. My vision stabilized too. I'll never see clearly out of my left eye, but I've adapted. Human beings are good at adapting. But some scars run deeper than bone and tissue. Some wounds never heal, just scab over and ache when the weather changes. I tell this story now because I think it's important that people understand what's really out there in the wild places, not the sanitized version you see in documentaries, where predators are just misunderstood animals trying to make a living, but the real thing, ancient, powerful, and completely indifferent to human life. We like to think we're at the top of the food chain, but that's only true when we're surrounded by our cities and our technology and our comfortable illusions of safety. Strip all that away, put us alone in the wilderness with just what we can carry, and we're just another prey animal, just another source of meat for things with bigger teeth. The bear probably didn't think of our encounter as a fight between two apex predators. To him, I was just another meal that put up more resistance than expected, something that stung him a little before he decided it wasn't worth the trouble. But to me, it was everything. The moment when I learned that survival isn't about having the best gear or the most training. It's about being willing to become something you never thought you could be when the alternative is death. It's about grabbing fire with your bare hands and using it as a weapon. I still wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, thinking I can smell smoke and burning fur. My wife sleeps peacefully beside me, safe in our climate-controlled house with its deadbolt, locks and security system, protected by all the barriers we've built between ourselves and the wild world. But I know better now. I know how thin those barriers really are, how quickly our civilized veneer can be stripped away when something bigger and stronger and hungrier decides we look like dinner. I know that somewhere out there, in the dark places where humans are visitors and not residents, there are things that don't care about our rules, or our technology, or our plans. Things that have been hunting since before our species learned to make fire. And I know that fire, simple, primitive, dangerous fire, is still our best hope of surviving when we meet them face to face. The Zippo clicks open and closed in my pocket as I finish this story. A small sound, barely audible, but it comforts me. Reminds me that I carry the power to create light and heat and safety wherever I go. It reminds me that I survived, that I used a burning log as a weapon and lived to tell about it. But mostly, it reminds me that the wild places are still wild, no matter how many maps we draw, or trails we cut, or stories we tell, that there are still mysteries out there in the darkness, still tests we haven't faced, still prices we haven't paid. And that sometimes, when everything else fails, fire is all we have left. The forest remembers, the darkness remembers, and somewhere out there, I think the bear remembers too. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all any of us can ask for. To be remembered by the wilderness, even if it's as the one who got away, the one who fought back with fire, the one who refused to go quietly into that long, cold night.